A very warm welcome from responsAbility to today's webinar on climate mitigation and beyond. responsAbility Investments is a leading impact asset manager specializing in private market investments across 3 investment themes: financial inclusion, sustainable food, and today's topic, climate finance. To make this session as interactive as possible, we encourage you to add questions to the Q&A, and we will get to as many as possible after the discussion with our panelists. For now, I invite you to join Robert Widén from our office in Stockholm, who will introduce you to our panel today. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Rachel, for that introduction. To start off, I'd like to welcome everyone who's listening in for today's session, Climate Mitigation and Beyond. I'm, for one, very excited about today's session, where we will hear insights from the COP29 and why private capital is essential in financing adaptation and mitigation strategies going forward. We will also hear on-the-ground case studies showcase practical applications of adaptation and resilience projects. So, it is with great pleasure that I introduce today's panelist. To start, calling in all the way from India, Sathish Dhanapal, Head of Climate Advisory Specialist at responsAbility. Sathish plays an instrumental role in advising on and developing new climate finance initiatives. It's great to have you with us today. How are you?
Thank you, Robert. Thanks for inviting me and thanks for setting up this webinar. Looking good. Really excited for this session.
That's great. Ready to share some case studies?
Yes. Lot more to share.
That's great. Looking forward to that. We also have David Diaz in Zurich. Welcome to you.
Thanks, Robert. Great to be here.
You are Head of Financial Institutions Investment Climate Finance at responsAbility. You lead the sourcing, structuring, and execution on investments. You're also an expert in designing green lending strategies and tailoring technical assistance programs across the global south. Did I forget something?
Sounds about right. Thanks, Robert.
But we're happy to hear more from you soon. And finally, I would like to welcome Maria Yetano. You are Senior Climate Impact Specialist at responsAbility. And what I think is extra interesting is that you come from the world of academia and research. So I couldn't think of anyone more suited to set the scene for today's session. And I think the listeners are also interested to hear a summary from the COP.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Sounds very, very affirming. That's good. So there has been a lot of conversations about the COP the past weeks. A lot of people have attended, and everyone seems to have at least observed it. So to start, I would like to ask if you could set the scene. Why is COP important?
Thank you very much, Robert, and good morning, everyone. Let's really start by maybe the question, what is COP? I think that's also important. COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and when we discuss in a climate change space, it refers to the annual UN Climate Summit, where we collectively negotiate around addressing the climate crisis. And it's a place where over 200 countries this year got together and discussed in a multilateral setting what can be done. And despite the criticisms that the process faces and has faced over the years, it does remain a place where decisions are made, and these decisions, we can think of them as setting the tone for global action and do influence policy and markets at very different levels, and sometimes send extremely strong political signals. The Paris Agreement goals, of course. So that's what I could say in terms of why it's important.
Perhaps can you walk through us what everyone's been speaking about, the past days as well, the climate finance agreement that was reached at the COP29.
Exactly. So yes, so maybe a lot of our audience will have seen this in the news. The COP29 wrapped up in the early hours of Sunday in Baku, in Azerbaijan. And there has been this number hitting the headlines, $300 billion. So this number, what does it mean? So this means that has been the agreement that has been reached at COP29, an agreement whereby, in terms of climate finance agreements, the agreement is that $300 billion will be channeled through public finance from developed countries or from historically industrialized countries per year by 2035.
Oh wow! But 300 billion is that enough?
So the answer is clearly no. It's still definitely falls short of what were the expectations and what assessments and different estimates have calculated in terms of what is the need from developing countries in terms of climate finance. But it is a rather complex issue. There has been, of course, widespread concern expressed about this and condemnation. But let me just explain that it's not all about this number. There are definitely discussions around the number. The estimates indicate that there should be around $1 trillion spent in climate finance per year in order to reach our goals from the Paris Agreement, and indeed that's the figure. $1.3 trillion is the figure that many negotiating parties were asking and putting on the table. This number is not the only issue. It's also a lot about how that number is split between public finance or highly concessional loans and the private finance and how it's spent. So I just want to make sure that we understand that there's an outcome in terms of a figure. The 300 billion has been agreed as a figure, but the number isn't the only issue. Yeah.
No. Oh, but this is interesting. I mean, this is really sending, in a way, a message to private capital to play a bigger role. Now, it would be interesting to hear if you see any trends or any specific themes that we can expect to see more from private capital flow into.
Yeah, no, and in fact, we can link it to this discussion on the agreement at COP29, but also more widely. So one of the discussions is, as I said, what role does private finance play in this $1.3 trillion needed in investments to mitigate and adapt to climate change by developing countries. It's an incredibly important part of this finance equation, but it's even more so now that we see that the public finance commitment up to now seems insufficient. So private investment will, have a huge role to play. And this is because of the sheer scale of the total investment that is needed. I think we all know it's already clear, and COP29 has reiterated this message that public funds are there to kickstart action, and private capital is needed to scale up, and that's quite a well-known approach. However, I just like to highlight maybe two things that are coming up in the private finance space as emerging trends. One is that we're seeing that more demand for increased alignment between what are private financial flows, purely private ones, and blended finance, with the country's mitigation and adaptation plans and development plans. Of course, economic development pathways in themselves need to be the finance flows need to be tailored, and we're seeing a lot of frameworks and taxonomies emerging in that sense. So private finance is where becoming more strategic, and it's more about ensuring that private investments are supporting the right kinds of projects and doing it so efficiently. And that's one trend. And the other trend would be there's an agreement that more adaptation finance is required, although COP29 didn't come up with a goal for that, unfortunately. But it is now clear that there's insufficient focus on it, and the role of private finance is becoming more important there. What are opportunities for commercial investments, what's the investable area for private capital in adapting to the effects of climate change? So I would leave it there as two main highlights, but there's of course many other issues being discussed at the moment.
Yeah, it is a 2-week conference, and there's a lot of things discussed. So I think you did a great job. I picked up increased resilience to climate impact whilst generating returns. I like that. That doesn't sound too bad. So thank you, Maria, for sharing your thoughts on the COP. And perhaps this is a good time to take a step back. And I mean, you mentioned adaptation. Perhaps we should clarify what adaptation is and how it differs from mitigation. David Diaz.
Of course, Robert. No, happy to provide an intro here. So I think many of our listeners are aware of mitigation, right? And this entails the reduction or the removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. When you think about mitigation, the location or the site is less relevant, right? A solar panel system in Costa Rica and a solar panel system in Mongolia have different contributions in terms of the volume of GHG emissions that they enable to be reduced, but they're still mitigation. They still serve an important role in helping us reduce the impacts from the climate crisis. In adaptation, it's very different. In adaptation, location, the site is paramount, right? Because you have to model the investment on the relevant local climate risks. And this isn't just local Mongolia. Within Mongolia, you have different climate hazards based on the geology, based on weather patterns in the north and the south and the east and the west. It's different. And for these reasons, you really have to have an approach that focuses first on what are the climate risks, and second, what are the ways to mitigate those risks, right? There's no one size fits all. Think of it this way, a drip irrigation system in a water-scarce country is highly adaptive. You're reducing pressure on local reservoirs, but in a water-abundant country, it's not, right? Whereas we have a different way of thinking of mitigation. Both remain incredibly important, right? And there's a movement right now in climate to talk a lot about adaptation, which is extremely important. But we can't forget about mitigation because they're both needed in tandem. But what I'm looking forward to is seeing how the world comes around the topic of adaptation, because definitions vary, conceptual gaps exist, and it's extremely important to have someone that can really bring a tailored investment strategy at the local level, especially given how rapidly these climate hazards are intensifying. So this is a key point to keep in mind.
And it's clear that it's not a one size fits all. What do you think, David? Should we? I mean, I asked Sathish before if he was ready to give some case studies, but should we ask him to give an example on adaptation finance?
I think you'll struggle to give just one. He's got hundreds.
Yes.
Just one. Okay, you start with one, Sathish.
True. Yeah. So,
Thank you.
see, thanks, Robert. So one sector which comes to my mind when we talk about mitigation adaptation is water, right? So water across multiple sectors, it has an impact. So if you look at, for example, industrial water consumption, right? So we see in most of the emerging market, there is a significant, enormous growth of industries, and that adds to significant water demand, right? It puts a lot of pressure on the local communities because the industries, it requires a lot of water for their operations. This is one side. On the other side, because of climate change, the water risk is also increasing, right? And then this you see in most of the emerging markets, like countries like India, Vietnam, and all these countries are exposed to severe water risk. So these two aspects puts a lot of pressure on the industries and also on the communities, right? So for industries, their business continuity is at risk because their processes depend on water, and if the water availability reduces, so their business continuity is at risk, and they become less sustainable. And on the other hand, the community, so industries taking water from the communities, and the communities, they depend on the local groundwater sources when they need this water in extreme conditions. So addressing these two problems, one of the solution could be this wastewater recycling, right? So wastewater recycling is an interesting example how this could address both the business as well as the community, right? So when you recycle wastewater, the industries are able to recycle water back into the process. So thereby they become more self-sustainable and they put less pressure on the water which are required for the communities. So it enhances the adaptive capacity of the industries as well as the community. So water is a classic example where we could look at adaptation from a broader perspective. But again, this doesn't comes at free of cost, right? So it also comes at a cost. When you have to implement a wastewater recycling, it is a capex intensive. That's one. But also the wastewater recycling process consumes a lot of energy for recycling the water, especially the evaporation process, which consumes a lot of energy to treat water, recycle water back into the process. So what we see in the market, and we have also invested in companies who are looking at innovating new solutions, thereby reducing significant amount of energy consumed in the wastewater recycling process. So to give example, we have invested in a company called Gradient. So they're a US based company, also having a significant operations in Asia. So they have developed many innovative solutions, which helps industries to significantly reduce energy consumption required for recycling water, but also enhances more water recovery from the wastewater solutions. Another company which we have funded is Clean Edge Resources, which is again a Singapore-based company having operation in Asia. So they are offering wastewater recycling as a service in a boot basis for a 10-15 year contract. So these two are two different business models, but targeting a similar way of supporting industries to become more resilient. So I feel this is a classic example of how a private sector based investment could add to adaptation and mitigation benefits.
Thank you, Sathish. I asked for one, but I got two, which is great. That's David was right in that sense. But I also like, I mean, you threw a curveball there at the end. I mean, there also can be a clear alignment with mitigation finance as well. Obviously, it requires a lot of energy for that industry. So thank you, Sathish. And now that we've involved Sathish, let's go back to David, because I want to dig a bit deeper into this. And also, I mean, we heard two examples from emerging markets. Why is adaptation especially relevant for emerging markets?
No, Robert, I think it's a great question. It's also a key question at discussion at the COP, as we've seen. I think there are two angles I'd like to highlight. The first is an equity and a fairness angle, let's say, because emerging markets, developing markets have contributed the least to the climate crisis that we're seeing today, and yet in many ways they're the most exposed, right? So the urgency of capital is highest in these markets, and yet they were the ones that contributed least to this crisis. And then second, I think there's an opportunity perspective as well, an opportunity angle. And here's when you look at pretty much any trend, be it demographics, economic growth, urbanization, industrialization, the evolution of food systems, you see that things are picking up at a rapid pace in emerging markets. And therefore, the need for capital to come in and ensure that those trajectories move towards more stable, adaptive, green trajectories is urgent. So I think there is a massive need for capital in this space. And as I was saying in my first response to your question, each country is different. You know, the countries have different technical potential with regard to solar, hydro, wind power, but they also have different needs with regard to food systems, what kind of investments need to be promoted to increase resilience to the relevant local hazards. So every country is different, but the need is high everywhere.
But I think those are fair points. And I think that's also why the general understanding or, say, perception out of adaptation finance is that it's perceived to be in the purview of the public sector. So we have two examples from the private sector. But what role does or can the private sector take a big role in adaptation finance?
No, absolutely. I think that's the other key question. And I think this is really a big misconception to some degree. I'd say it's a big misconception that adaptation is the domain of the public sector and mitigation is the domain of the private sector. Actually, the need for and the commercial viability of a resilient or adaptive investments is high, right? Now, when we think about adaptation, it's important to separate different kinds of adaptive investments. One is the kind of dike that will ensure that rising rivers don't flood a city, right? That is unlikely going to be funded by a private enterprise. That's a public municipality that's going to make that investment. And I think when people think adaptation, they think that, right? However, every person, every company, every SME, every corporate living and working and operating in our world today is exposed to climate hazards. That's just a reality, and these climate hazards are getting worse. And there are financially viable, commercially viable investments that individuals and companies can make today that will reduce their vulnerability to these risks. What's important is that these investments make financial sense, right? If you are living near a flood zone and if you're a building developer and you're constructing a new residential complex, for example, you need to understand whether that complex is going to be in a flood zone, right? And you should try to avoid that. And if it is, and if it's not possible to avoid that, then you need to make sure you have an elevated foundation, right? Yes, there is additional capex that comes as a result of this thinking, but it protects the viability of that business, of that building to operate, and the continuity there is the crucial win. So I'd say both have a role to play. That's a little bit thinking at sort of on the ground level, but I think also when it comes to investors, we really need private capital to enter the space. Public capital can play a very important role in sort of de-risking fund structures and providing comfort on financial flows and sort of catalyzing development in a sector. But the private sector is crucial if we're going to scale this and if we're going to actually achieve any meaningful benefits over the long run.
Thank you, David. I mean, when you put it that way, it does make a lot of sense as an asset manager to look beyond mitigation, not only for the opportunity, but also to close the adaptation funding gap. Perhaps what capacity building is needed and why doing so is something which would be a big question. And I would think that question would be good if I asked Sathish. I mean, when we spoke prior, you speak a lot about capacity, Sathish. I presume adaptation finance requires a certain capacity. Perhaps you can elaborate on this and what capacity responsibility as a asset manager or impact asset manager has developed over time.
Sure. So just taking a step back, right? So to ensure the private capital flow to climate investments in emerging markets, you need a good strategy, and equally important is also a good capacity, right? So like our division, like responsAbility, like asset managers. So this is our early realization in the process when we started to scale our climate finance portfolio 10 years back. We realized climate finance is not about lender-borrower relationship; it's about partnership. And for us to build a partnership, you need to have capacity in the form of team who understands the market, who understands technology, and more importantly, the team who is closer to the investing companies, and they're someone who can understand the challenges the investors are facing in scaling climate investments. And this is exactly we realized early on in the process when we started building an in-house team, the team which I lead, which is called Global Climate Advisory Specialist. The team brings in expertise across multiple technologies, multiple sectors, and the team works with the investors on the ground to ensure these climate strategies are implemented. So this early realization of building an in-house capacity helped us to scale our climate finance investments. And we also leverage this in-house capacity to develop new strategies, because for us to develop new strategies, we need on-the-ground market insights on what is the need in the market and what strategies we could develop. So we leverage this capacity to build new strategies. Now coming to adaptation, right? So here capacity is more and more important, right? So as David mentioned, mitigation is a global phenomenon, right? So where everyone is contributing to this global phenomenon. When it comes to adaptation, it's very location specific, right? So each location has a different vulnerabilities they're exposed to. So here, the biggest challenge in adaptation finance is the lack of awareness around the climate vulnerability people are exposed today and also in the future. So this is the biggest gap. And what type of strategies that you could implement to become more adaptive to these vulnerabilities? So for us, it is as we already done it for mitigation, and we do it in the similar way in terms of building our in-house capacity, so that we could leverage this in-house capacity to help build capacity of the investors companies to help them understand the vulnerabilities they're exposed to this for the specific region, and help them develop strategies, and we can channel our investments to address towards those strategies. To give an example, we've expanded our investment area into climate smart agriculture. So we have a strategy which focuses on climate smart agriculture. So now we also have experts who have worked in the climate smart agriculture sector for over a period of 5-10 years, and they are in our team who helps invest these companies to understand the climate risk and help them develop adaptation strategies. So this is already a natural extension that we have done, and we realize that it is a continuous process, and we continue to build our capacity so that we are always geared up to support our investees and investments. So summary, capacity building is really critical.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Sathish. And I see your passion towards this, and you really seem to enjoy your job, and especially the partnership part. I mean, a borrower-lender relationship is always not the way forward. So I really thank you for that input. And perhaps, I mean, looking at time, I think we have time for another case study, perhaps, Sathish, if you want to. Perhaps you covered water. Perhaps agriculture is something which we would also think about when we speak about adaptation.
Sure. Yeah. No, definitely happy to. So agriculture is a sector where they are severely impacted by climate change, but they're also significant contributor to the climate change, right? So they are in the middle, stuck with both worlds. And there are many strategies which are available to address climate risk and also mitigation in the agriculture sector. David already covered on irrigation, right? Drip irrigation. So irrigation consumes a lot of energy also, right? So when you have drip irrigation, it adds to reduced water consumption, reduce energy for pumping, and also enhance productivity, overall increasing the resilience of the farm. But another example, interesting example is agroforestry in agriculture practices. So agroforestry is a practice where people integrate trees in the farming system. So when you integrate trees in the farming system, from a mitigation perspective, trees absorb CO2 from the atmosphere and stores it in the stem and also in the soil, thereby adding to the sequestration benefits. And trees also enhances the soil fertility, right? So because there's a biomass from the trees leaves, it adds to the soil and thereby reducing the amount of nitrogen fertilizers application, thereby again reducing the impact of CO2 equivalent from the farms. From the adaptation perspective, it adds a lot of value because these trees act as a shade and they act as a windbreaks. So basically, they regulate the microclimate of the region, and this is very important, especially in regions where they face extreme heat and drought conditions. And these trees also ensures or enhances the soil retention, water retention, and this is also critical for water scarce conditions where they can retain more water during this extreme conditions. And on top of it, this system, agroforest system, also adds to the biodiversity, right? So this enhances the ecosystem balance in the region. So one practice adds to multiple benefits, and again, if you look at agriculture as a sector, there is no one solution or one technology or one practice. It is a combination of practices, and all these are proven scientifically, and we continue to explore more of these strategies on the ground. And this is a classic example of both mitigation and adaptation. And if you look at all the examples, Robert, all these things connecting back to what David mentioned. So adaptation is not just about public sector, large infrastructure, large projects, but you can look at adaptation in each and every investment strategy, and especially these sectors like water, agriculture. There are opportunities where the private sector could actually play a role, and that's what we see as a partner demand.
Definitely, yeah. And I mean, you said multiple. I mean, those are, I can list a couple of different. I mean, agroforestry seems to be the solution to climate, but I guess it's not easy adaptable to every location. It's great that I'm in Sweden. There's a lot of trees, so I guess we're good in a way. But I mean, that sounds quite interesting. It does. And I mean, with that, looking at time, I think we should perhaps look at some questions. One question which we have received is, let's see if we're taking the right. Yeah, this is an interesting one. How can you attract investors to adaptation projects? I think that is key, really, isn't it? So, David, maybe you want to give a go. You're a deputy head of a large fund as well, so you're facing with this.
No, I think it's a It's a great question. And look, when you look at an investor, when you're designing a fund, you have to have you might have different tolerances in terms of risk, in terms of return expectations. So one thing is to really think closely about what kind of investor am I trying to bring into this fund. Public investors might have really a priority on the impact and on the catalyzing effect that that funding is going to have. And private and sector investors might be a little more risk averse, right? So one thing is designing a fund that makes sense and works and aligns the incentives of both. The second thing is really ensuring you have a clear pitch, right? You have a clear narrative for what your capital that you're raising is going to achieve. And this is where I've often seen sometimes adaptation oriented strategies fail, is that they can be a little bit nebulous, a little bit clouded with regard to what are you actually going to invest in with regards to adaptation. How are you going to measure the impact of that adaptive investment? And how can you really convince me that these investments are going to be commercially viable, that the risk-adjusted return makes sense? And I think if you focus on those three questions and you focus on aligning investor interests, I think you can really succeed in raising capital.
Okay. Well, it's good to hear. I mean, as Maria alluded to, we need all the prior capital we can get as well. So that's good to hear. I mean, I would like to dig more into how you would measure adaptation. I think that's interesting. You touched upon it.
Sure.
Yeah, you want to take that?
I think it's one of the more fascinating parts of the of the discussion, because when you look at mitigation, you have an indicator. Usually it's carbon, it's GHG emissions that are saved. And for many institutions, 20% is the threshold. But when you look at adaptation, the KPIs vary, right? It can be water saved. It can be number of resilient buildings financed. It can be something more sophisticated like loss avoided, right? So climate risk related loss avoided as a result of the CapEx investment. What's true here is, and it's true with what we said at the beginning, there's no one size fits all. There's no single KPI that is relevant to every investor or relevant to every project. So we have to really design a set of KPIs that are sensible, that are feasible to implement, and that are meaningful for both people on the ground and investors.
Sounds fair. I mean, there's no CO2 emissions saved, really, perhaps. Maybe that could be one. Maybe, yeah.
That's mitigation.
That's mitigation, definitely. Yeah, sure. Great. We have another question here from the listeners, and it's regarding this person has been at a sustainable finance course in Rotterdam, and this person also says that impact ESG finance is becoming that almost all finance would be impact finance. Now, do you think, this is a more general question, I guess, but do you think it increases the chances of greenwashing? And what steps are taken in the sector to preserve the credentials?
Yeah, I think the fact is that market is also moving, right? So we see a lot of these asset managers also come up with strategies. So that is also a fact that you see a lot of climate-focused funds in the market compared to 5-6 years back. You see a more and more climate-focused fund. That is also more from the market demand perspective. There's more and more climate funds or ESG funds coming into the market, and you see. But there is also increased chance of these greenwashing, because then you have more competition in the market, but also you see people claim to have a climate focused or ESG focused, but in terms of the reality, the implementation part will be missing completely when it comes to these strategies. So for us, I think we are always clear right from the beginning, and our strategy is not about claims. Our strategy is about implementation. That's exactly what I mentioned as a partnership approach, because we are very closer to the investees on the ground, and our impacts are not measured by Excel sheets, tick marks. Our impacts are measured on the ground by working closely with the investor companies because we build a lot of capacities, right? So we build capacity to investees, we help them grow, and we grow with these investees. So for us, it's very clear on our approach. But on the broad market level, there are also global taxonomies are getting developed. EU as a taxonomy, but we also see because EU taxonomy is more EU specific, but we also see each of the markets, emerging markets, also they are building their own taxonomy, and that will be the way to go in terms of addressing these local claims towards climate ESG.
And I think that is an interesting question, and the person who asked that question, you're free to reach out to us afterwards as well, because that could be a whole session itself, really. So please reach out afterwards. There's another question which just popped up, and I'm happy that question came up, because when I'm at conferences, not only on adaptation, but also on mitigation and other climate actions, is about scaling. And the question here in particular is, how can we scale adaptation projects, and which regions are leading the way? And perhaps if you would like, maybe not focus it only on adaptation, but perhaps on mitigation. Maybe, I mean,
Yes, an initial stab. No, I think that I think in order to scale two things. I mean, when you're investing in emerging markets, you have several barriers that we kind of forget about in the global north, right? Awareness is often low. Supply chains are often lacking. So you might think, yeah, but solar is everywhere. Why is it so difficult to set up a solar project? It might be because there is a complete absence of awareness on the risks of solar. Financial systems are ready to finance them, and there might also not be a supply chain ready to fix the panels or replace things if things break down. I mean, solar is now quite mainstream, but it's an easy example because that applies across the value chain in mitigation: renewable energy, energy efficiency, awareness, supply chain, and just the number of successful cases in a country generally are quite low. So what we have to do is increase the awareness, is develop the ecosystem. So this is where Sathish's team and is so crucial, because both on the investment side, but then also on the advisory side, we work with our partners on the ground to help them understand the ecosystem, help them understand the key challenges, so that they feel comfortable taking those first steps in a new investment strategy, because for many of them, it's often new. And then once you have that initial runway, think of a plane taking off, right? It takes a little bit of speed before you really can get off the ground. That's when things start to work on their own. And I'd say a similar narrative applies to adaptation. I think here the challenges are even more significant because you're at an earlier stage in many of these markets. Awareness is even lower. There is this misperception that it's only for the public sector, and there is really a lack of a sense of what the suitable, and Sathish nailed it when he said, what is the actual climate risk? And should I really invest this much capex today to mitigate a risk that we're uncertain about tomorrow? And that's the knowledge we have to bring. That's the awareness we have to bring. We have to develop positive pilot cases, and on those pilot cases, we can scale a strategy. So we've done it before in several markets, and I think it's something that we look to continue doing.
Here's a direct question to you, actually. Can we speed the spending of money pledged from COP?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very that's a hard one, because this has always been, it's recognized already since many years that even when climate finance is there, it's not mobilized at the speed that we would like. And why not? There's several factors at scale in terms of speeding up and scaling up, and some of which have just been discussed in terms of the high risk context and the capacity issues sometimes. From both sides, investors and investees. Now, I'd say the money pledged from COP will not have an issue of how much we can mobilize. It's also a gradual increase until 2035. But I think in general, what we're talking about is to have really a smarter use of the existing concessional finance to mobilize the private finance, and learning from the lessons of the decade. So that is not just an increase in the amount of concessional finance, but how different instruments, from guarantees to any kind of risk reducing instrument, can better mobilize the private finance. And lately, there's also been discussions on how the spending needs to be diverted from the climate change inducing investments. That's another way to make investments in climate change mitigation and adaptation more attractive to investors, is to make the others less attractive. That's also a great solution for the speed question, which is not, honestly, we know it's not the only question. It's also about effectiveness and impact.
Yeah, we have a timeline, so it's good that we could speed things up, and it's great that there's a lot of solutions. It's just we need to implement them as well. So that's it's a tough cookie in that sense. It is for sure. I think we have time for a final question from the listeners, and then we'll wrap things up. I think this one is really directed to you, Sathish. How do you see the compatibility of emerging market taxonomies with the EU taxonomy?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, so EU taxonomy is a great starting point for the European market, right? And that already is helping a lot of these European investors to have a clarity on these strategies being deployed within the Europe. But when you take this taxonomy to the emerging markets, there's definitely a big challenge in implementing EU-specific regulations in the emerging markets. And that is one of the key reasons why there are local governments developing their own taxonomy. Obviously, it will be aligned with EU taxonomy, but they will customize it with the local requirements, because there are local regulations and local context, because there is a lot of investment aspects to it and there is a lot of implementation aspects to it. So we see the way forward is each of these markets develop their own taxonomy, and then they apply it across their boundaries, and then gradually move towards the global taxonomy requirements. And that's how we see the market moving.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. Good. I think perhaps we should ask, I would like to ask the panel one final question, but just in one sentence, try to be very brief. What you would like the listeners should take away, if they should take away one thing from today's seminar. Maria, perhaps you want to start.
Yes, so I have two closing thoughts.
One
is, let's remember when we are in the finance discussion, the more abstract discussion, that really the finance drives action on the ground. I'm sorry, that might sound obvious, but it's that when we discuss how much and how fast, this really influences how ambitious and how hopeful we can be about addressing climate change. And the other parting thought from me would be that despite the big numbers that I cited, 1 trillion, over 1 trillion per year, that apart from it not being actually such a big share of global GDP and less than is spent in other sectors, it also far less than what it will cost us, if we can even calculate it, to face the worst extremes of climate change.
That's good takeaways. So it's good that you took two. David?
Yeah, I think two short and sweet ones. I think the first one is collaboration is paramount. So when you're addressing a problem like the climate crisis, that's there's multiple issues at once. You need many minds, you need many perspectives, and a lot of experience. So don't approach it just from a financing angle. Don't approach it just from an engineering angle, not just an ESG angle. It's everything together. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, stay optimistic, because I think these days there's a lot of doom and gloom, and if we don't find a way forward, then it gets worse.
What makes that? Just to add there as well, because we had one final question which I didn't get to ask. What makes you optimistic?
Oh, that's a longer question. Well, but for me, I'll say it quickly. It's having people like Sathish and Maria that I can work with every day and see that if you have different minds and different perspectives together, you can actually achieve tangible change. So that makes me optimistic.
That's great. That's great. Sathish, can you top that?
Yeah. Yes. So in fact, David already addressed it. So because we believe in this approach of this collaboration partnership, right? So and I think for that you need mindset shift at both levels, at the asset managers level, right? To understand it is important to have this in-house capacity so that you can look at investments from the right perspective and leverage this capacity to help investees build strategies to address their climate concerns. So mindset shift with the partnership approach is the key takeaway from my perspective.
I think that's a great note to end today's session. I think partnership, collaboration. I really like those words, and I would really like to thank you, the panelists, Maria, Sathish, David. I mean, it's been a really interesting session. You've shared a lot of expertise and experience. Please reach out, listeners, if you have any more questions afterwards. And thank you, listeners, for all these questions. So these are really, really good questions as well. And there's obviously much more questions which we also face. So please reach out afterwards as well. And feel free to follow us on LinkedIn or on YouTube. We have a lot of great content there as well. We also now have a podcast series, Voices of Impact Investing. So, finally, I would like to wish everyone a wonderful day. And let's remember that in order to fight climate change, apart from collaboration, we cannot only focus on mitigation or adaptation, we have to do both. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you.